So today is such a grim day in Germany. But yeah, nevertheless, we should make a wrap up, right? For a great nonfiction November challenge. And let's begin. Please get comfortable because I think it's going to be a long one and I have a lot of books to discuss. So yeah, let's begin with the fact that I was planning to read 8 books. And if you watch my videos, you knew exactly which books I was planning to read. Instead, I read 7 books. And I will show you everything that I was planning to read and everything that I read in this video. Let's begin with my fails, shall we? Because there is nothing better than to accept fails in your life. And in my list of fails this month was History of Korea. So shameful that I couldn't accomplish this book because, well, I simply didn't have time. I couldn't even pick that up because I had so much to read and I spent so much time reading and I was kind of exhausted. And honestly, I think it was my personal record to read so many books in 1 month, especially some of them are rather complicated. But yeah, the second book that I couldn't finish, but I started and I tried, is A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. I don't know why this book is considered like a popular physics, like physics for very layman in the area of physics, because I couldn't understand a big part of it. Like, for example, the first chapter was, I think, fine because it was more about the history of physics and how we had different perceptions throughout the historical time, which was fine, great. But then he starts to explain like all these different concepts of time and how the universe works, and I just lost it. I couldn't even understand what he's talking about, and it was funny, like he explains all those different very complicated theories, and then at the end he writes a very coherent, very accessible conclusion, but I was like, how did you come up with this conclusion? I couldn't understand the process of your thinking. So that was a very big problem for me. I even like asked my husband a couple of questions like what that means, how does it work, and because he knows way better than me things about physics and stuff and world. So but even asking somebody who knows better than you didn't help me to comprehend the book, so I dropped it after reading like 3 chapters. I'll certainly give it a chance. Maybe I was not in the right mood, I don't know, maybe it was just I'm just too tired cognitively, but yeah, again, my fail, but still I'm going to read it. I will read it. It will be my Mount Everest. Yes, the third book that I didn't finish, but again I started to read it, was Georges Bataille, Eroticism. I briefly mentioned that in my TBR, but obviously it's a very complicated philosophical work. And again, it's a work in translation. It was originally written in French. And I have a lot of problems with translated works from French to English, especially. Like, for example, I was trying to read Claude Lévi-Strauss, and that was so hard, so difficult. Or, for example, Simone de Beauvoir. I don't know why, but French translations into English are very difficult for me. I understand that English is still my second language and French is not even on the list, like except a couple of words. And like I think for some reason it is just more difficult for me to read than just simple English books. I don't know why. Maybe it's because of the nature of French language, or maybe because the translation, like trying to be the same as French, but it just doesn't work. So I don't know why, but it takes more time for me to read these kind of works, translated French works. Yeah, sometimes I would reread some of the pages, but still it's very challenging yet fascinating read. There are a lot of things to argue about with George Bataille, and this is what I really like about some of the books, is that you pick up a book and you have a chance to argue with the author, and that is really, really great feeling that, oh my god, I'm not stupid, I actually disagree because of that and that. And so yeah, and you kind of like have this dialogue with the author. Obviously the author doesn't respond to you, but maybe they will, because, you know, book develops itself and it brings different arguments. Anyways, I had slightly different expectations from Eroticism, because I thought it's kind of like an investigation on history and anthropology of eroticism and our sex behavior throughout the history. Yet, well, it's not. Here's a small correction. Of course, he does use anthropological methods of research. He actually got this idea from Claude Lévi-Strauss, but it's just not the whole book about it. It's not the main goal, so to say. He dedicates a couple of chapters to it, and it goes like a leitmotif throughout the whole book. But again, it's not the whole idea. Georges Bataille introduces his hypothesis in the introductory part, and he states that his main goal is actually compare eroticism and religion, as has a lot of similarities. I have no idea why and how he came up with this idea, but apparently some of the, let's say, inspirations was the work of Marquis de Sade, Justine, or The Misfortunes of Virtue. This book, I think, deserves some attention, but I wouldn't recommend it to everybody. Let me explain why. Justine is considered one of the libertine literary works, and libertine is usually a term that would describe a person whose moral standards differ from the moral standards of the society, and especially it includes maybe sexual deviations, deviations that are different from the standard sexual behavior. And that term was very common throughout the 18th century and 19th century. And so Marquis de Sade himself is considered libertine. He had such a scandalous life, full of sexual experiments and adventures. So he ended up in the prison, and so the first version of Justine was finished by him in the prison in 1787, and it was about 100 pages. This second edition was finished in 1791, and it consists about 250 pages. And the last edition that was written in 1797 was about 1,000 pages long, and that last edition actually consisted of so many and predominantly pornographic scenes, whilst the short novella of the 1791 and 1787, they are more philosophical, and they consist more of this dialogue between the main character Justine and the characters she encounters. So basically she encounters a lot of horrible people, perverts and pedophiles, and she has this dialogue with them about virtue, about the religion, the nature of religion and belief. And so obviously it has some very obscene pornographic scenes, but they are not that explicit as I can imagine are in that later edition. However, what is problematic about this book is not just, as I said, pornography, but rather blasphemy, because I can imagine that for the person of the 18th century or 19th century to read these thoughts that were very provocative, very challenging for a religious person, that would be, I think, a slap in the face. And I understand why this work threatened the author with a death sentence, because Marquis de Sade was very often accused of this various deviations, and also his influence in writing this literary work, or libertine literary work. But I understand why this book was so revolutionary, because obviously at that time nobody could afford to explain these ideas in the book. And obviously it was written on the edge of like this epoch between the Enlightenment era and the formation of the atheistic philosophy. However, for the contemporary person, I think it's not that relevant. That's why I would love to read, for example, Christopher Hitchens, who's like a very important atheistic philosopher of our time, rather than Marquis de Sade, because again, yes, it was very important historical work, but I'm not sure if it's actually very relevant and viable work of our days. Anyways, and now let me continue with the book that I actually finished, finally, and the books that I'm really proud of. So I would love to begin with this beautiful book, which is called Word by Word, A Secret Life of Dictionaries by Kory Stamper. That is such a lovely book that made me appreciate the work of lexicographers even more. Because I never actually thought about it, how the dictionaries are created and how important they are in the current discourse, in the linguistic discourse. That is why I really adore this book. It's not just interesting and educational, but it's also very easy to read, very light and very funny. There are numerous of cases when I was smiling to this book because Kory Stamper is just she's a very funny person. She's I believe that she's also interesting to talk to. So yeah, and that was interesting and pleasant time with this book that I spent. And what I actually did is that when I was reading George Bataille Eroticism, I would read like one chapter of Eroticism, and because it was like too intense and complicated, I would switch to the chapter of Word by Word, so like to breathe fresh air and to understand that yes, I still speak English and it's not me who is stupid, it's probably just the book that is complicated. So yeah, I would recommend this to everybody. It's like 5-star read, really great one. And the next one I already mentioned in my non-fictional readathon is The Whole Picture, the colonial story of the art in our museums. So yeah, I have nothing else to say apart from what I already said in that video. If you want, you can watch that. I'm not sure it's the best book about the colonial history and problematic history of museums. However, I think it's worth it. It's worth it to have it in our world, and I think we should have just more books like that. And now let's move on to the hot subjects. And there are 3 books that I think very important to read like right now, if not yesterday. And the first one, I already mentioned that in my non-fictional readathon, is The Gates of Europe by Serhii Plokhy, A History of Ukraine. It's as I already told in that video, it's a great historical book, very clear, coherent, very accessible, yet academic. However, when I finished that book, I thought like, oh, something is missing. I wanted to read even more. So I quickly ordered this book that was actually recommended by a book Olive in the originator of the Nonfiction November challenge. It is a Borderland, a journey through the history of Ukraine by Anna Reid. Anna Reid is a journalist, and she worked in the 90s in Ukraine, right at the beginning of the new history, a new page in the history of Ukraine. And she you might consider her an expert in Ukraine, in modern Ukrainian history. And this is what is it actually about. She matches, of course, very like sort of important episodes of Ukrainian history from the far past. However, she is more concerned with like modern history, the history of 20th century, 21st century. And this is what I think we should all appreciate about this book, is that she describes the events that would actually lead to the current situation. And if you want to understand what's going on right now, I would recommend to pick that one. there's actually one little moment. I was reading this book together with the audiobook. Sometimes I do that, especially when it's a history book and I just want to learn how to pronounce some terms and names in English. So I was listening to audiobook while reading the hard copy, and I noticed that this fully updated edition was published in 2015, yet by this year 2022 she already changed some of the content, because the audiobook that I had on Audible was updated like in November, like I don't know, this month, last month of 2022, and she added in the last part of her book 2 chapters that are occupied with like current events, with the war that Russia started on Ukraine. So yeah, I would recommend, I think, read audiobook instead of hard copy, just because, or even if you have hard copy, maybe obtain an audiobook, because it has a little bit more information which are very crucial for today. So yeah, and then obviously in order to understand what's going on in Ukraine, you also need to understand what's going on in Russia. And there's nothing better than read a book. And the one that I read this month or last month is Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, Adventures in Modern Russia by Peter Pomerantsev. So Peter Pomerantsev, as already told you in TBR, was born in Kiev in that time Soviet Union. However, he immigrated into the UK when he was a little kid, so his parents moved there with him, obviously, and yet he in 2000, like in the beginning of 21st century, he travels to Russia in order to work for various media. So yeah, and he begins his career in journalism in entertaining channel that is called TNT. And so this is basically the collection of stories told throughout the stories of different people. So he picks like a representative of one social group and tells about his or her story, and then he kind of like shows through the stories the condition of people in the beginning of 21st century in Russia, which was very interesting. Some of the stories are familiar to me. We all knew them from various media. We probably knew some of the people, like people of this particular group. For example, he describes in one of the first chapters gold diggers, like young, usually women, who would hunt for very rich oligarch and search for any opportunity to, establish a better life. Or another representative, it would be, for example, a person from, I don't know, from criminal past, and what he would do with the media, that this person would publish a book, for example, or make a movie, and so he would actually present, again, through the story and through the media that they produce, the condition of these people. It is fine, but the only problem that I had with this book is that it's not representative of all groups, because in Russia there are so many people, obviously, and I understand you can't like cover everybody, and of course he talks from his own experience, the stories that he encounters in his adventure through Russian media. And also another problem with this book is that I expected actually something different from this book. I thought that he will explain me how propaganda works, and in a way he does. He does this indirectly. He says like, yeah, you see what they're doing right now, and he's like blinking and saying like, yeah, that is the sign, that is the red flag of propaganda and totalitarian regime. So, however, I think there are better books about it, also told through the stories of people, such as, for example, Masha Gessen and The Future is History. Phenomenal work. I would recommend to read that instead of Peter Pomerantsev. Again, it's worth your time, I would say, because maybe read both of them because they're all like wonderful, and they catch the glimpse of the time, the zeitgeist of Russia in the beginning of 21st century. And I think it's also important to understand what was going on with people at that time in order to understand why that happened, what led to this tragic historical moment that is like that is happening right now. But what I appreciate about this book is that it actually presents a lot of female stories. Again, not every female group, but still some of them. And I'm really appreciative that he pays attention to this side of society. So yeah, that was very interesting. But again, go read Masha Gessen. Phenomenal journalistic and historical work. Just love it. So yeah, okay, it became too dark, so I turned on the light. Another book that I wanted to mention is I was planning to read it as part of the nonfiction readathon, but I couldn't manage because of the time, obviously. Yet it is such an important book, and I'm glad that I finished it this month. It is Susan Sontag and her, well, let's say 2 essays, Illness as Metaphor and AIDS in its Metaphors. That is such a great read, and I can't stop recommending it to everybody because it is a very coherent, very clear text that explains you how we use language, how the language that we use in one sphere integrates into other spheres of our life. Like how, for example, military language is used in the medicine, and vice versa, how a medical language might be used in military vocabulary or in other areas of our life. So it is very important to understand how language works, and Susan Sontag does a great job in explaining it in Instruments of Art and Language, and how it is used in other areas. So can't recommend it enough. So yeah, this is a great one that I picked this November. And the last but not least, and probably the most important book this month for me, because it is I can consider as my personal achievement. It is the second book that I read in German, and it is called Wir Kinder von Bahnhof zu by Christiane F. So that is, I think, can be translated in English as We Are Children of Station Zoo. And I think this is a translation of a movie that is based on this book. However, I heard that the English translation of a book is different. And I don't want to actually say it because it's kind of like a spoiler also. But anyways, so it's a story from Christiane, basically autobiography of her experience in the 1970s in Berlin, in the area near the train station Zoologischer Garten, which is translated zoological garden. I think it's rather obvious. So in that area, and the very famous street Kurfürstdamm Straße, it was basically the heart of a heroin scene, what she called a heroin scene. People, marginalized groups, primarily children, who would go there and be part of this dark story of Berlin, let's say. So she tells a story of her own experience, and that is a very, let's say, accessible if you learning German language. I can assure you can pick it up and start reading it without any problems. Obviously, I personally, I needed support of a dictionary. I actually marked some of the words. I kind of write a translation above the word in the language of my convenience. And so yeah, that was just one, let's say, language problem for me, just vocabulary. Again, some of the words are slang, or some are words idiomatic, or some are idiomatic expressions. So That was rather difficult, but again, it's all Googleable. Is that a word? Did I just invent the word? Maybe. Anyways, so from the language perspective, that was not difficult to read. And when I talked to my colleagues, they all are familiar with this book, obviously, and they agreed with me that yes, indeed, the language is very, very simple. When I started to read Justine, I unintentionally started to compare them because they are both kind of like coming of age stories. But the biggest difference, and I think important difference, is that Justine is the story of a fictional girl who has all this philosophical investigations with these horrible people that actually I think don't deserve to talk to. Yet she's trying to convince them, right, in her, let's say, opinions. Yet she still has all these problems because the author wanted so. Christiane, on her side, just lived her life, and she describes this life as it was. That's why I think I appreciate this story even more, because this is just, this is how it happened. Sometimes there were no logic. Sometimes it just happened. Sometimes it was part of circumstances. So this is what I love about it. It's more realistic. But what I really love about this book is that it actually opens up a lot of discussions. First of all, what I noticed first of all is the discussion about surroundings and environment, because she starts her story with their family moving into a so-called Gropiusstadt, which was an area in Berlin and I think still is, of basically utopian architecture, this perfect communal city where everybody lives in this high, tall buildings. And this is where she moved with her family. And I really appreciate how reflective her thoughts on the surrounding and how her interaction with this environment actually, I think, affected her very much in the future decisions in her life. And so this is one of the most interesting parts, I think, I find. So if you are interested in this perspective, if you really love to see how environment is described and affects the characters of the book, check that out. Another perspective can be actually, for example, a feministic one, to see the condition of women of this marginalized group is very comprehensive. Or, for example, the relationship between sexes in this book, also like quite interesting, I would say. Or one can actually take a psychoanalytic approach to see this story and see how, for example, her relationship with her mother and the parents and their parents might affect her life. But even bureaucratic description, even like sometimes Kafkaesque of this story, reminds how unfair sometimes life is. And I don't know, I just from one side I thought, oh, that's such a simple story, like even I can understand it. Yes, obviously, because it was written by like a very young person who had this complicated problems. Yet you can, if you want, you can interpret them, you can learn a lot from them. Maybe dive deeper in some of the subjects, such as, as I told you, environment in Berlin of the 70s, or the state of development of feminism. Yeah, why not? There's, I think, a lot to unpack, and that's why I really appreciate this book. Oh, yeah, so it took me half of the day to make this video, and I'm sure it's gonna be long. However, thank you very much for watching it, and thank you very much to listening to me. And if you have any thoughts about those books that I mentioned, or if you have any recommendations, maybe something similar to what I read this month, please go in the comment section and share those recommendations and comments with me. Again, thank you very much for watching it, and I'll see you next one. Bye!